The neighborhood had always been quiet, the kind of place where people waved at each other when they passed on the sidewalk and children played in the yards without worry. But beneath that calm surface, tension simmered, especially with Karen living on the corner house. Karen had a reputation in the area. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed everything, who kept a list of every minor rule and expected everyone else to follow it perfectly. It wasn't that she was mean exactly. She just had a very strict sense of order, and anyone who didn't follow it could expect her to speak up. For some, this was harmless, but for others, it became exhausting. A few weeks ago, the narrator's relative had moved into the house next door. They were a gentle and friendly person, someone who liked peace and quiet and kept to themselves most of the time. They enjoyed tending to their small garden in the backyard and often took long walks in the evening, waving at neighbors they passed. At first, everything seemed fine. The relative was careful, respectful, and polite. They thought living in a quiet neighborhood would be easy, but they hadn't counted on Karen's watchful eyes. From the beginning, Karen seemed to find a reason to complain. One day, it was a small branch that had fallen from a tree onto the sidewalk. Another time, it was the sound of the relative mowing their lawn in the early morning. No matter how careful they tried to be, Karen noticed every little thing. She would march over, pointing out the smallest infractions, speaking in a sharp voice that left little room for discussion. The relative tried to smile and respond politely, hoping that calm words would ease the tension, but it only seemed to irritate Karen more. The situation escalated slowly. A week ago, Karen had called the neighborhood association, complaining about a minor fence repair. The association had come, inspected the work, and found nothing wrong, but Karen's discontent lingered. She would mutter to herself while walking her dog, glancing at the relative's house with a critical eye. The neighbors noticed the tension but mostly stayed out of it, assuming it was just another minor quarrel that would fade with time. But the relative began to feel a little uneasy each time they saw Karen's glare from her porch. It was a sunny afternoon when the incident that would change everything began. The relative had decided to bring in groceries from the car. They had parked at the edge of the driveway and were carrying bags toward the house. Some were heavy, some light, but none of them posed any real danger or obstruction. They moved carefully, making sure not to step on the grass or block the sidewalk. It seemed like a simple, everyday task, nothing unusual or wrong. But Karen saw it differently. Karen was watering her plants when she noticed the relative carrying bags. Her eyes narrowed. In her mind, the driveway was being used improperly. She felt that something in that action was a violation of the rules she held dear. Without thinking much beyond her immediate sense of annoyance, she grabbed her phone and began dialing. She didn't stop to consider the relative's perspective, or the fact that they were simply taking groceries inside. Her sense of right and wrong in this moment was very black and white, and Karen firmly believed she was in the right. The relative noticed her pacing but thought nothing of it. They waved politely, hoping to show that there was no conflict. They even smiled and said hello in a friendly tone, but Karen didn't respond. Her fingers were busy pressing numbers on her phone. The relative continued bringing in the groceries, careful not to make noise or cause disturbance. But Karen's frustration was growing. Every step the relative took, every movement of a bag seemed like a deliberate challenge to her rules. She muttered under her breath about how some people had no respect, and pressed the call button on her phone with more determination. While Karen spoke quickly into the phone, explaining the situation with a dramatic tone, the relative stopped to set down a particularly heavy bag. They looked toward Karen and called out politely, asking if there was a problem. Karen barely glanced up, focusing entirely on the conversation she was having with the person on the other end. The relative shook their heads slightly, returning to their task. From their perspective, they were just living their life, being careful, polite, and responsible. They didn't understand why Karen seemed so angry. Neighbors had begun to notice the commotion. A few peered out from behind curtains, trying to see what was happening without getting involved. Some whispered to each other, wondering if the situation was serious or just another neighborhood quarrel. The relative was aware of the watching eyes but kept their focus on the groceries, hoping that by staying calm and polite, the situation would pass without incident. Little did they know, Karen had already made up her mind and was determined to involve the authorities, convinced that the relative had broken some invisible rule. As the relative carried the last bag inside, Karen continued speaking rapidly, detailing her complaint. She described the relative's actions with words that made the situation sound far more dramatic than it really was. She mentioned the driveway, the timing, and even invented minor offenses that hadn't actually happened. In her mind, every detail added weight to her case. She wanted to make sure that the police would understand just how serious the situation was, at least from her perspective. The relative, now inside their home, paused at the doorway and took a deep breath. They could hear Karen's voice through the open windows and knew the call was serious. They weren't angry, only a bit frustrated that a simple misunderstanding had escalated so quickly. They decided to wait calmly, knowing that the truth of the situation would be clear soon enough. They didn't shout or argue. They simply went about setting the groceries down and arranging them in the kitchen. Their calm demeanor stood in contrast to Karen's frantic energy. But it also made the relative wonder why someone could become so worked up over something so minor. Meanwhile, Karen continued pacing, phone pressed to her ear. Her tone was firm, bordering on dramatic as she described the relative's supposed behavior. She didn't notice the small details around her, the way a neighbor had stepped onto their porch to watch quietly, the sound of children playing a block away, or the calm figure of the relative inside, minding their own business. She was focused entirely on her own sense of order and justice. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood, upholding rules that everyone else had ignored. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew. The relative could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, signaling that Karen's call had prompted a response. They didn't panic. They continued calmly, arranging groceries, checking on a pet, and making sure everything was in order. They knew that when the authorities arrived, the situation would be explained clearly. They trusted that honesty and calmness would show the truth. Karen, on the other hand, felt a sense of vindication. She had done what she believed was her duty. She would not tolerate disrespect or disregard for neighborhood rules. Every step the relative had taken in that driveway, every bag carried inside had seemed like a deliberate provocation. In her mind, she had acted swiftly, correctly, and with authority. She didn't yet realize that this simple misunderstanding would soon take an unexpected turn, one that she could never have anticipated. The relative's calm, polite behavior contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic energy. They had no idea who Karen really was beyond the strict, complaining neighbor they had encountered. They didn't know that the next few moments would completely change Karen's perception of them. As the sirens grew louder and the officers approached, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them fully understood yet. The neighborhood watched in quiet anticipation, sensing that something more than a minor dispute was about to unfold in the calm, ordinary afternoon had turned into the beginning of a story that would be remembered for months. Karen's fingers trembled slightly as she held the phone, speaking quickly and clearly about every detail she had noticed. She painted a picture of the relative as careless, disrespectful, and intentionally disruptive. In her mind, she was doing a good thing, making sure the authorities would see the neighborhood's rules were being enforced. Each word she spoke felt important, like she was standing up for her community. She barely noticed the neighbors watching quietly, or the relative calmly finishing their chores inside. She didn't stop to think that the call she was making might be unnecessary, or even an overreaction. To her, this was a small battle that needed immediate attention. Inside the house, the relative heard the muffled sounds of Karen's voice through the windows. They paused for a moment, recognizing that someone had decided to escalate a simple misunderstanding. They took a deep breath and focused on remaining calm. They knew that anger or confrontation would only make the situation worse. Instead, they decided to continue their routine, making sure everything was in order and prepared should the police arrive. They understood that misunderstandings could happen, and often the best way to handle them was with patience and composure. Karen, outside on her porch, continued pacing. She repeated details, emphasizing points that were minor at best, hoping to make the situation seem urgent. She described the movement of groceries, the time of day, and even the way the relative had carried themselves. In her mind, each small action was evidence of a bigger problem, and she was determined to make sure the authorities understood her perspective fully. Her tone was firm, and she spoke as if she were telling a story of danger and chaos, though to anyone watching it seemed trivial. Neighbors whispered quietly to each other, curious about the escalating situation. Some leaned out of windows, trying to catch glimpses without being intrusive. Others peered from behind curtains, wondering if this was serious enough to require police intervention. The relative noticed the small signs of attention but chose to ignore them, knowing that staying focused on calm and polite behavior would be more effective than reacting to curiosity or gossip. They had always believed that honesty and steady composure carried more weight than arguments or complaints. The relative decided to step outside briefly, keeping a safe distance from Karen. They wanted to address the situation politely and prevent further escalation. As they walked toward the porch, they called out in a calm and friendly voice, asking if everything was all right. Karen barely looked up, her attention fixed on the phone conversation. The relative's words, meant to ease tension, seemed to fall into the void. Karen's mind was already occupied with the idea that she was reporting a serious issue, and her focus on the call made her oblivious to the friendly approach. The moment felt tense but not threatening. The relative maintained a calm expression, showing no anger or frustration. They were careful to stay a few steps back, respecting Karen's space and ensuring that their actions could not be misinterpreted. From a distance, it looked almost like a routine exchange, a polite neighbor checking in. But for Karen, the same moment was filled with tension and urgency. Every movement and word was filtered through her perception of being in the right, protecting the neighborhood from perceived misconduct. As the conversation continued, the relative noticed Karen's pacing slowed slightly. She seemed agitated but unsure. Perhaps she sensed that the situation was not as dramatic as she had imagined. The relative offered a gentle smile and explained that they were simply bringing groceries inside, that no rules had been broken, and that there was no reason for concern. Karen listened, but her voice on the phone remained firm, insisting that the authorities needed to come. The relative nodded politely and stepped back, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the police. The distant sound of sirens soon reached the neighborhood, signaling that Karen's call had prompted a response. The relative did not panic. Instead, they calmly continued their routine, making sure their home was in order and that they were prepared to speak with the officers politely. They understood that the truth would become clear once the police arrived. There was no need to exaggerate, no need to be defensive, just honesty and composure would suffice. When the police arrived, the scene became a mix of quiet tension and curiosity. Karen immediately pointed at the relative, repeating her accusations in a hurried and slightly frantic tone. The officers remained calm, professional, and neutral, asking both parties to explain the situation. The relative spoke clearly, explaining that there had been no rule violations and that the actions Karen had complained about were simply part of normal daily life. Their tone was calm, polite, and unhurried, in stark contrast to Karen's anxious energy. One officer, a little curious, asked a few routine questions about the relative's background. At that moment, Karen's expression began to change subtly. She paused, a look of surprise crossing her face, her voice faltering for a brief moment. She recognized the relative instantly, not just as the neighbor she had been complaining about, but as someone she had known in a very different context, someone important and influential in her past. The air seemed to shift around her confidence faltering as a wave of recognition washed over her. The relative remained calm, unaware that Karen had made this realization. They continued speaking politely to the officers, providing clear explanations and demonstrating that no wrongdoing had occurred. Their demeanor was gentle and respectful, showing no anger or pride despite the accusations. This calmness made the contrast with Karen's earlier energy even more pronounced. Observing neighbors whispered quietly, sensing that something significant had just happened even if they could not fully understand it. Karen's sudden recognition of the relative brought back memories she had not thought about in years. She froze, her usual assertiveness replaced by a moment of uncertainty. She had expected a routine complaint call, nothing more, but now everything felt complicated. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the polite, calm neighbor in front of her with the person from her past, someone she had known in an entirely different setting. The realization made her words stumble, her usual confidence faltering. The officers, unaware of the personal recognition taking place, continued their professional approach. They asked for more details, clarified events, and ensured that the situation was understood correctly. Karen tried to respond but found her voice uncertain, her usual certainty gone. The relative answered politely, sticking to the facts and remaining composed. Their calm approach further highlighted Karen's hesitation and the sudden shift in her demeanor. Neighbors who had been watching quietly began to murmur among themselves. The quiet tension was palpable, everyone sensing that something unusual was happening. The relative, still composed, gently explained that the groceries had been carried inside without any disruption or rule violations. The officers nodded, taking notes, and soon it became clear that there had been no cause for alarm. Karen, still frozen in recognition, began to realize that her call might have been unnecessary and that her assumptions had been hasty. Karen tried to regain her composure, speaking softly now and attempting to justify her actions. She stammered slightly, her voice lacking its previous authority. The relative, seeing her hesitation, offered a gentle nod and a small smile, not mocking or scolding, just acknowledging the shift in the moment. This simple act of kindness and calmness made Karen's realization even more profound. She understood that she had misjudged the situation, and that her behavior, while well-intentioned in her mind, could have been embarrassing or even serious. As the police completed their investigation, it became clear that the relative had done nothing wrong. Karen's sense of authority was replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of her mistake. She apologized softly, not out of fear, but from the realization that she had misjudged the circumstances and misread the situation entirely. The relative accepted the apology with a calm nod, showing that there was no need for tension or hard feelings. Their patience and composure had allowed the situation to resolve peacefully, highlighting the power of calm and polite behavior even in moments of conflict. Once the officers left, Karen retreated into her house, thoughtful and subdued. The relative returned to their routine, arranging groceries and continuing with their day as if nothing significant had happened. But the quiet neighborhood had changed subtly. Neighbors now whispered about the incident, amazed at how quickly tension had escalated and how dramatically it had shifted in a matter of minutes. The relative's calmness had diffused a situation that could have become stressful or confrontational, leaving a sense of relief and subtle admiration among those who had witnessed it. In the end, the incident became a story about perception, patience, and understanding. Karen had called the authorities with the belief she was acting responsibly, while the relative had shown that honesty and calm composure could resolve tension effectively. The neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm, but the story lingered as a reminder that sometimes conflicts are not what they seem, and moments of recognition and reflection can change perspectives in ways that are subtle yet lasting. It was a quiet lesson about the power of patience, the importance of understanding, and the surprising ways the past can intersect with the P. The officers stood calmly on the quiet street, listening to both sides carefully. Karen was pointing and talking fast, explaining her version of the events. Her words were full of urgency, almost like she believed the world depended on her account. But the relative stayed composed, speaking politely and clearly. They explained step by step what had happened, that they were simply bringing groceries inside and that no rules had been broken. Their calm and clear voice contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic tone, making the difference obvious to anyone paying attention. One officer asked routine questions about timing, locations, and actions. They wanted to understand exactly what had happened and why Karen had called. The relative answered each question patiently, without raising their voice or sounding defensive. They provided small details to show they had been careful, responsible, and polite throughout. The officer nodded, noting the explanations, and then asked Karen to explain again. Her words started to falter as she realized her description now sounded exaggerated in light of the relative's calm and precise responses. Karen suddenly paused mid-sentence. Something about the relative's presence and calm demeanor struck her as familiar. She squinted slightly, trying to place where she had seen this person before. Her confidence, which had been so steady moments ago, wavered. She realized there was something unusual about this neighbor, something she had not noticed at first glance. Her hands shook slightly as she held the phone lower, momentarily distracted. The officers, trained to observe behavior, noted the sudden change in Karen's energy, but they did not yet know the reason behind it. The relative continued answering questions, staying polite and approachable. They smiled occasionally, gently, showing no frustration. Their tone remained friendly, and they did not let the situation make them anxious. Even as Karen grew more flustered, the relative maintained the same calm approach. It was a quiet strength that made Karen's sudden recognition even more pronounced. She froze for a moment, her mind trying to reconcile who the person in front of her really was. Karen's recognition was subtle at first, a slight hesitation in her speech, a pause in her confident tone. Then the memories began flooding back, small details she hadn't thought about in years. She remembered past interactions, situations where she had known this person in a completely different context, someone influential and important in her life, someone who had made an impact long ago. She felt a mix of shock and disbelief, unsure how to respond. She wanted to maintain her authority, but her past recognition overpowered her focus on the current situation. The relative, unaware of the sudden shift in Karen's perception, continued their explanation. They described how they had parked carefully, carried groceries without blocking the driveway, and always made sure to follow the rules. Their calm and precise tone made it clear that there had been no wrongdoing. The officers listened intently, asking clarifying questions and taking notes, but they could see that the relative was not hiding anything or exaggerating. Their honesty and composure were evident in every word and gesture. Karen struggled to find words. She had expected a simple complaint call, nothing dramatic, but now her mind was racing. The person she had been reporting was someone she had known in a completely different, far more serious setting. Her usual confidence was gone. She stammered slightly, trying to maintain composure, but the recognition had shaken her. Her previous certainty, the sense that she was fully in the right, now felt fragile. She was caught between two realities: the calm, polite neighbor standing before her and the person she had once known. With influence and authority she had never fully appreciated, neighbors watched from behind windows and on their porches, sensing a shift in energy. They whispered softly to each other, trying to understand why Karen's tone had changed so suddenly. Some speculated quietly, but none of them could know the truth. The relative remained completely calm, continuing their explanation with patience and clarity. Their demeanor was gentle but firm, showing that honesty and politeness could carry more weight than panic or aggression. The difference in energy between Karen and the relative was striking, and it made the unfolding moment even more dramatic for those who could see it. One of the officers asked Karen to clarify her main concern. She paused, trying to collect herself. Her voice was quieter now, more uncertain. She gestured vaguely at the relative, but the words that came out did not carry the same force as before. The relative, seeing her hesitation, nodded politely and offered a small, understanding smile. They did not mock or criticize, but simply remained calm and composed, showing patience and empathy in their demeanor. This simple gesture further disarmed Karen, making her realize the gravity of her overreaction. Karen's mind raced with memories and recognition. She remembered the way this person had behaved in professional settings, their calm and confident demeanor, their kindness, and their ability to handle difficult situations. She realized that she had misjudged their character entirely. What she had perceived as a simple neighborly dispute was nothing compared to the person's true nature. Her earlier anger and frustration now seemed misplaced, and she began to understand that the situation was far less serious than she had imagined. The officers, noticing the change in Karen's tone and energy, continued to document the situation carefully. They asked routine questions, but their focus shifted slightly as Karen's recognition became apparent. The relative, still calm, explained the events one final time, emphasizing that there had been no rule-breaking or misconduct. They spoke politely, answering questions fully, and demonstrating respect for both the officers and Karen. Their calmness had diffused the tension and made the truth clear. Karen tried to speak again, but her words stumbled. She looked at the relative with a mixture of shock and realization. The officers listened carefully, noting that Karen's original complaint had been based on a misunderstanding rather than any actual violation. The relative's calm and honest approach had made the situation clear. They did not raise their voice, argue, or try to prove a point. They simply presented the facts, showing patience and respect. This had a profound effect on Karen, who now understood the magnitude of her error. As the officers began to finish their investigation, Karen's confidence was replaced by quiet reflection. She apologized softly, her voice lacking the authority it had once held, and admitted that she may have overreacted. The relative accepted the apology with grace, showing that the situation could end without conflict. Their gentle demeanor emphasized understanding over anger and calmness over confrontation. The officers nodded, satisfied that the matter had been resolved peacefully, and prepared to leave. Neighbors continued to watch quietly as the situation concluded. They whispered among themselves, impressed by the calm resolution and by the way the relative had handled the situation. Karen, still shaken, retreated into her house, leaving the scene with a newfound awareness. The relative returned to their own routine, completing small household tasks and organizing groceries, maintaining the calm and peaceful rhythm of their day. The quiet neighborhood had returned to normal, but the incident left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. The events of that day became a lesson in perception and patience. Karen had acted with the belief she was protecting the neighborhood, while the relative had demonstrated that calmness and honesty could resolve conflict more effectively than panic or aggression. The contrast between the two approaches was striking, leaving an impression on the neighborhood. It was a reminder that not every perceived problem is as serious as it seems, and that sometimes recognition and understanding can change perspectives in a profound way. By the end of the day, the relative's calm and polite approach had turned a potentially stressful situation into a quiet lesson for the entire neighborhood. Karen, reflecting on the events, realized the importance of pausing, observing, and understanding before reacting. The story quietly lingered in the minds of the neighbors, who now had a new example of how patience, honesty, and a steady demeanor could resolve even tense encounters. The day that began with tension and a frantic phone call ended with a subtle but meaningful shift in understanding for everyone involved, leaving a sense of relief, reflection, and quiet respect. Karen stood on her porch, her hands gripping the railing tightly, trying to steady herself. Her usual bold confidence had evaporated, replaced by a strange mix of shock, recognition, and uncertainty. The neighbor she had been calling the police on was no ordinary person in her eyes anymore. This realization had come so suddenly that it left her frozen, unsure of what to say or do. The officers watched her calmly, accustomed to observing tense situations, but they could sense something more personal had shifted. Karen's face was pale, her breath caught in her throat, and she couldn't help but glance at the relative standing a few feet away, calm and composed, unaffected by the drama. The relative, aware that the officers had questions, remained polite and steady. They spoke clearly, explaining that they had done nothing wrong and had simply been performing normal daily tasks. Every word was measured, gentle, and respectful. They made no attempt to assert dominance or intimidate, and their calm presence created a quiet authority that was felt by everyone present. Their demeanor subtly shifted the atmosphere, and even Karen felt the pressure of their composed confidence. She wanted to argue, to insist that she was right, but her recognition of who this person truly was had shifted her perspective. Karen's mind raced as she remembered past interactions, situations that had shaped her understanding of this person. She realized that their calmness, patience, and clarity were not new traits, but qualities that had defined them for years. Suddenly, her previous certainty about the situation seemed misplaced. She had acted quickly, assuming the relative was being disrespectful, without considering the possibility that she had misunderstood. Each memory that surfaced made her feel smaller, and her usual assertiveness faltered. The officers, noticing her hesitation, continued their procedure with professionalism, asking simple questions to ensure clarity and fairness. The relative's voice remained steady as they responded to each question. They described their actions politely, explaining how they had parked, carried groceries, and ensured that nothing disrupted the neighborhood. They spoke without a hint of frustration or defensiveness, showing that they were confident in their truth, but also patient with the misunderstanding. Their calm and gentle approach highlighted the stark contrast with Karen's earlier tension and frantic urgency. Neighbors who had been watching quietly whispered among themselves, impressed by the relative's grace under pressure. Karen's recognition grew stronger, and with it came a feeling of vulnerability. She had expected the day to be routine, with a simple complaint call to the authorities, but instead she found herself confronted with someone she had long respected, and perhaps even feared in past circumstances. Her energy shifted from bold and controlling to hesitant and reflective. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Every word seemed inadequate, almost foolish in the presence of the relative's calm and composed demeanor. She gestured vaguely, attempting to clarify her concerns, but the clarity and honesty of the relative's responses overshadowed any argument she tried to make. The officers continued to guide the interaction, ensuring that each party had the opportunity to explain, and that the situation remained calm. Karen spoke softly now, her tone a mixture of apology and embarrassment, but still she could not meet the relative's eyes fully. The relative remained polite, offering small nods and gentle smiles, showing that the situation could end without conflict. Their patience and composure allowed the tension to dissolve naturally. It became clear to everyone present that no rules had been broken, and that Karen's initial alarm was the result of a misunderstanding amplified by her own perceptions. Karen struggled to regain control, but the recognition of the relative's character made it impossible to assert the same confidence she had felt earlier. She realized that her assumptions and hasty judgment could have led to unnecessary consequences. She understood that her actions, although intended to protect the neighborhood, were not justified. She looked at the relative, seeing not just a neighbor but someone who commanded respect effortlessly through calmness and honesty. Her earlier frustration melted into quiet reflection and humility. The relative continued to answer questions from the officers, patiently clarifying any points of confusion. They remained approachable, ensuring that the process was smooth and non-confrontational. Each answer was calm and concise, leaving little room for misunderstanding. The officers, taking notes and observing carefully, were able to see the truth of the situation clearly. They recognized that the relative had acted responsibly, without any intent to disturb or violate rules. Karen's flustered demeanor and hesitant apologies highlighted the contrast, making the resolution even more apparent. Neighbors who had gathered to observe the scene were quietly fascinated by the unfolding dynamic. They whispered softly to each other, noting the calm authority of the relative and the sudden vulnerability of Karen. Some admired the way the relative handled the situation with patience and respect, understanding that such behavior diffused tension effectively. Others were curious about the sudden shift in Karen's behavior, sensing that recognition and realization had transformed her perspective. The neighborhood, previously accustomed to minor quarrels, witnessed a profound example of how calm composure could resolve conflict. Karen attempted to apologize more fully, her voice still quiet but sincere. She acknowledged that she had misjudged the situation and overreacted. The relative accepted the apology with a gentle nod, showing understanding rather than judgment. This simple gesture spoke volumes, emphasizing that conflicts could be resolved peacefully and with empathy. The officers completed their review, confirming that no violations had occurred and that the relative had acted appropriately. Karen, still reflective, took a step back, allowing the moment to settle. As the officers departed, Karen retreated into her house, still thinking about the relative and the unexpected encounter. The weight of her misjudgment lingered, but she also felt a quiet lesson in humility and awareness. The relative returned to their day, organizing groceries, checking on household tasks, and maintaining the calm routine of their life. The quiet of the neighborhood resumed, though now tinged with a subtle sense of admiration and respect for the way the incident had unfolded. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed quietly with discussions about what had happened. Neighbors spoke of the calm and polite way the relative handled a tense situation, and the sudden recognition that had shifted Karen's demeanor. The story became an example of patience, honesty, and composure in the face of misunderstanding. It highlighted how small conflicts could reveal deeper truths about people's character, and the importance of approaching situations with empathy and calm reasoning. Karen's perspective had shifted significantly. She had started the day with a sense of authority and certainty, confident in her judgment and eager to enforce what she believed were neighborhood rules. By the end of the encounter, she had been humbled, forced to acknowledge that she had misjudged both the situation and the character of the relative. The quiet reflection that followed allowed her to see the value of patience and understanding. It was a subtle but meaningful change, one that would influence how she approached interactions with neighbors in the future. The relative's calm approach left a lasting impression, not only on Karen but on the observers in the neighborhood. Their ability to remain composed, polite, and honest under pressure became a quiet example of effective conflict resolution. It demonstrated that patience and empathy often speak louder than frustration and urgency. The neighborhood, once merely quiet and orderly, now had a story that reminded everyone of the value of perspective, calmness, and respect. By the evening, the tension of the day had dissolved, leaving a sense of relief and quiet reflection. Karen, though still processing the encounter, had learned a powerful lesson about assumptions, perception, and humility. The relative had handled the situation gracefully, reinforcing the idea that calm composure and honesty can overcome misunderstandings. The story lingered quietly among the neighbors, a reminder that even small conflicts can reveal important lessons about patience, character, and the way we interact with others.